Hey YouTube, this is Steven with On My Way to Fire, a channel about early retirement and all things investing. And I want to take a moment here and just do a remembrance of Alan Greenspan and what he meant to the Fed and the economy of the U.S. over the last, 50 years. Wow. I woke up to the news today that he had passed away at 100. And I hadn't really thought about him in terms of what he did, but I use a lot of his sayings, and one of them was irrational exuberance. And that's one that's always stuck with me. And in fact, I used it in a video early on when I started posting here on YouTube. He also used the term about a frothy market. And he often would make kind of strange, ambiguous statements to where you didn't really know what he meant during Fed meetings. I was probably too young to really appreciate what he did at the time. But he was appointed to succeed Paul Volcker in August of 1987. And within a few months, we had the huge Black Monday crash in October of that year. And through his statements and assurances of continuing liquidity in the market, he was able to calm the market. And, we recovered from that financial crash rather quickly, all things considered. And in modern terms, it was more of just a blip. So, learning some more about him, he was into jazz music, which is kind of cool. And when he got into the government and the White House, prior to being in the Fed chair, he was a key person that was looked to for a lot of guidance. And he got some blame at the end of his career, mainly because what was considered an easy Fed. But we had to take a lot of things into consideration. And he led us through some great times, financially speaking, and a great expansion of the economy of the U.S. from the 90s into the 2000s. But ultimately, we had the dot-com bubble burst, then we had 9/11. And so, that was a very scary time of the economy. I was about 18 at the time, 17, 18, and I remember learning about some of the stuff that was going on and just being confused of how the economy could be in a tailspin so quickly, and how the Fed was involved. I would kind of see some of it on the news, but again, I had just graduated. Again, I did learn a little bit in that class, but I wasn't really paying my own bills. I was living at home, and I didn't really have a concept of the way all these things tied together. But a few things I do remember quite distinctly. Coming out of September 11th, the economy had kind of come to a bit of a standstill, and people weren't spending money. People were scared. And, we didn't want to travel. There was flights were grounded. The market was closed, I think, for a week or two. It was just a lot of crazy times. And a lot of the car manufacturers started doing 0% financing on cars and trying to really get stimulus going. And so that transcended to all across the market. Credit cards were offering 0% transfer rates on all these things. And the Fed lowered the interest rate to the lowest. I think it was 1% at the time. So that's as low as they go. So just really, it might even have been 0.25%, something like that. But it was just really an extraordinary time. And people blame the extension of those low rates leading to the housing crash. But we got to keep in mind, that's from 2001, 2002, when that really was getting going, to the houses becoming a commodity that, Wall Street banks and investors were flipping houses, leading to all the stuff that we see on HGTV with the Flip This House and these sunset shows. That was the beginning of all that. And, generally we just thought of a house as a place to live in, but it became an investment. And I looked at some of his comments, and he was talking about how he really believed in home ownership and how to, advance that through the U.S. population. So we had some great interest rates at the time of around 3.5%, 4% on 30-year fixed. And it really got a lot of people into homes, but I wasn't quite old enough to take advantage of that at the time. And so what I witnessed, I eventually got into the mortgage industry around 2004 through 2007. And I guess in some ways I have to be thankful to Alan Greenspan for expanding those, policies to allow different types of loans and more borrowers into homes, because I benefited from the great expansion in the mortgage market. But ultimately what ended up happening was we had so many people refinancing debt over and over again and not managing their lifestyle that they became serial refinancers. And in some cases, they had bad credit, and they would get what's called a subprime loan, where they got maybe a 6 to 6.5, even 7% interest rate, when other people were getting 3.5 and 4%. But that rate was only fixed for a couple years. and it would have what's called a prepayment penalty attached to it. And that meant if they refinanced the loan or sold the house, they'd be subject to a penalty of 6 months interest, because it basically locks you in for the 2 years. And hopefully you improve your credit, you can refinance into a better loan, but sometimes people miss payments on those loans and then they're stuck doing another subprime type of loan again in the future. So some of these people were in like an endless loop, and I would see the same application come through. Within a 3-year period, they were already on their second or third loan. So at some point they didn't care, and they kept rolling over all the costs and prepayment penalties into the new loan until they were out of equity and they couldn't do anything. And we also had another type of loan called pick-a-pay or negative amortization. And what that type of loan was, it was a commission salesperson's dream, because they could make a lot of money on those loans. And the way it worked was, if they had a loan of $500,000, minimum payment might only be $1,500, but principal and interest might be $2,200. That differential of $700 gets added to the loan amount, and then the interest is reassessed the next month. So it's continually increasing. And after a period of time, these loans have basically blew up, and people defaulted. And then you have something on the other side of the mortgage-backed securities. And with those, they were sold in CDOs, collateral debt obligations. And you can watch the movie The Big Short to find out some more information on how all that worked. But basically, between 2007 and 2008, I saw all this happening in real time. And these loans were just getting worse and worse. The quality of them was bad. And you were getting less A-paper loans. And that would be a person with like a 720 to 800 credit score, no missed payments. And the pricing of the houses kept going up, but the income wasn't quite catching up with a regular person, and people were stretching more and more to get into these houses. And so you also had other things called Alt-A, and these are people with mediocre to okay credit, maybe like 650 to 680, not quite 720. And that led to IndyMac and Bear Stearns and all that stuff, where those type of companies really specialized in those type of loans. And so all that stuff fell, and we had the financial crisis. And that happened 2.5 years into Ben Bernanke's term at the Fed. And a lot of people blame Alan Greenspan for allowing those policies to get as bad as they were. But, I had to do some research on that. And although he was aware of some of these loans, I don't think he had the full understanding of how bad it was in the industry. And you have all these different agencies that are still supposed to overwatch, these type of loans. And as a result, the CFPB, which is the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, they came out as a result of the financial crisis in 2008. But, overall, during his tenure, Alan Greenspan was highly regarded, especially going into 2000. But later, as we look back, post-2008, his legacy has been diminished a little bit because of what happened. But I don't think we can fully blame him for that. There's a lot of blame to go around to the banks themselves, and just the American greed in general of how these things got out of hand, for all about the profit and the almighty dollar, into the point of total collapse. And, I was out of work at the time for a few months, which felt like forever. And eventually I got a job in mortgage servicing and switched out of mortgages directly, because that market was just gone. But in general, I have to thank Alan Greenspan for setting the framework for getting my career started in finance and doing what I do now. But he was a titan, and we continue to use his sayings today. And so I just wanted to take a minute of appreciation to reflect on his career. And, he primarily, stayed out of the spotlight after he left the Fed. And he wasn't really forced out, but he was going to be 80 years old if he were to, be renewed again. And he was appointed by several presidents, starting with Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton twice, and then George W. Bush. So pretty amazing across different political spectrums. He was highly regarded. But, a lot of stuff is Monday morning quarterbacking, looking back on what happened. I don't think, at the time he thought he was doing anything wrong. But a lot of criticism to what was considered lax Fed policy in terms of, having an easy money approach. And that led up to stocks going very high in the dot-com bubble bursting. And then the ESA policy with home loans and how that got out of hand. But, you know, quite a career, a person that definitely, whether I knew it or not, would shape my life for the rest of my life. And so I just want to take a minute to thank him for his career. Rest in peace, Alan Greenspan. Thanks. See you in the next video.